Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar. This particular one is about buying real estate in Mexico. We do this webinar every year. It's really designed for people that are ready to jump into the buying process. We have some other webinars that go over frequently asked questions when people are kind of feeling out whether they want to live here or buy here or invest here. That one's called Finding Your Paradise. If you're kind of at that initial step, I would recommend you watch that one as well. This one dives deep into the weeds in buying so that by the end of this, you understand how to foreigners invest in Mexico, all the hows and whys, and get you well on your way and comfortable with moving forward in investing. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. This is me. If I have not had the pleasure of meeting you, you'll be able to put a face with a name. I'm Amber Pierce. I'm originally from Michigan. I'm a graduate of Michigan State University, so go green. I have two boys. They're 11 and 16. If you know them and you haven't seen them in a while, they've gotten pretty tall on me. I began visiting Puerto Morelos in 1998. Puerto Morelos is a small town just south of Cancun, which is growing. And I moved here full-time in 2004. I am the broker and owner of a company called Mayan Riviera Properties. And I started this webinar series some time ago in order to offer expats and investors solid information that they can rely on wherever you're at in Mexico. And this is sort of the information that I wished were available to me when I was getting started. And, you know, I mentioned I've bought and sold properties, I've built properties, I've remodeled properties, construction, residential and commercial, both. I've rented, I've been a landlord and dealt with landlords. I've done property management as well as condominium association management. And so, you know, but on top of it, I've been living life here. So I've had two boys. I've, you know, had to register them as U.S. citizens. I've, you know, voted from abroad. I've bought cars, you know, all of the things that come up. And so because of that, I try to share good information and bring in guest speakers when needed to be able to provide us with really good information so that we can make good decisions and make our Mexico experience a positive one, because it certainly can be, and Mexico presents a lot of opportunity. So I give you that background about myself so that you have a better frame of reference of where I come from, why I do this, but also please feel free to ask me any questions and I'll do my best to answer them if I can. This is my company, Mayan Riviera Properties. I started it in 2006, and we focus in three areas, primarily in Puerto Morelos. We consider ourselves Puerto Morelos property specialists. I do real estate sales, we do vacation rentals, and we also do property management. In that, we include condominium association management. I am federally certified with two certifications. I'm certified to sell real estate in Mexico and also a more specialized one selling in Mexico's tourist zones. I have my state license. I'm in the state of Quintana Roo here in Puerto Morelos. I have my state real estate license. And I'm members of two professional realtor associations. One is called AMPI. That's the green logo on the right. AMPI is the Mexican Association of Realtors. I'm also a member of NAR, which is the U.S. Association of Realtors. So I mentioned those. Those are two affiliations that I have. Also, to be able to put a face with a name, if you happen to contact the office, you're either going to get in touch with myself or Laura, especially if you contact us about sales. Laura works with me in the sales department. She's originally from Texas and has been living in Mexico since 1996. She's been selling real estate in the Riviera Maya for over 20 years. And she's also held various positions within that Realtors Association I just mentioned, AMPI, including president of our local chapter. Laura's been very, very active in AMPI throughout her career. And she's a buyer agent here at the office. So if you contact us, one of us will be responding to you. Laura and I also figured out that as of 2020, we have 40 years of combined experience. So we hope to be able to, you know, offer that to our clients, our investors, and we've seen quite a bit and over our time, and hope to bring all those experiences to your table and help you make your investments successful ones. Let's go ahead and get started. This is just kind of a fun slide to get started. I always tell people to avoid margarita fever. There is definitely appropriate times for margaritas after closing, but prior to close, I don't want you to have to rely on information that's secondhand, maybe from people that are certainly well-intentioned but not well-informed. The folks at the local, pub or cantina. I want you to have really, really good information. So hopefully by the end of this webinar, I think you will be able to understand the process, be able to be ready to make good decisions, and then you can always enjoy your margarita afterward. A couple of things we're going to cover today. We're going to answer some really basic questions. Can I own in Mexico? Is my investment secure? What are my financing options? How do I find a realtor? What does the property search look like? And then we're going to walk through the buying process, making an offer, the closing process, and then moving into your new place. So the first question everybody asks is, can I own in Mexico? And I'm here to say, yes, you can. Okay, foreigners can own in Mexico. And so we're going to tell you how to do that. We're going to focus primarily in this webinar on residential properties. We're going to mention commercial properties, but by and large, people on this webinar are going to be interested in residential properties. So while we will talk about some about commercial, we will be focusing on residential properties, but a lot of it is true for either. So I think whether you're interested in residential or commercial, you'll get quite a bit out of this webinar. Residential properties that are held by foreigners in one of two ways. Okay, so if you're looking at residential property, you're going to own in one of two ways. And the question is that property located within the restricted zone? We're going to talk about what the restricted zone is in a moment. But if it is in the restricted zone, then you as a foreigner will hold that property in a bank trust called a Fideicomiso. And that is a requirement for properties within Mexico's restricted zone. Now, if you're buying a property that's located outside of the restricted zone, you can own that in a fee simple deed, which is just a regular title. You are able to own in a direct title as a foreigner if you are buying a residential property outside the restricted zone, as well as commercial properties outside the restricted zone. Okay? So if you're outside the restricted zone, you can own in a deed. We'll talk about how that may not be what you end up doing, but within the restricted zone, it is a must. You need to own within a bank trust. Commercial properties, okay? If you're looking at a commercial property, the most typical way is you will have opened up a Mexican corporation and that property will be deeded into the name of your corporation. It is also possible to use the bank trust and receive direct title of a commercial property as well. So you can use a bank trust for either, but most typically commercial properties are going to be owned by your Mexican corporation. I would say that if you are interested in commercial properties and you're not sure whether to title it in the name of a corporation or title it within a bank trust, this is really a question of how your company is set up and what you plan to do with it as far as what tax advantages or obligations you may have. And this is going to be a question for your accountant and your attorney as you're structuring the company. By and large, most people that buy commercial properties will go ahead and put them into a Mexican corporation, okay? Title them into the name of that corporation. So if you're asking yourself, what the heck is the restricted zone? How do I know if my property's in that? Let's go over this, okay? To understand the restricted zone, I think it serves us well to take a step back and understand why it exists. Let's go back to the time of the Mexican Revolution. Prior to the Mexican Revolution, Spain inhabited and occupied a lot of land and within Mexico, okay? And the Mexicans finally got tired of being feudal serfs and indentured servants for the Spanish on their own lands. And as history shows, it often happens, they had a revolution that kicked out Spain, okay? And after kicking out Spain, Mexico's history is fascinating, but after kicking out Spain, series of events, finally they get to the point where they can create their constitution. It's around the turn of the century. And in the Constitution, they felt it was a matter of national security to create a restricted zone around their borders. So if you look at the map of Mexico that we have here, there are red borders that are coastal borders. The restricted zone is 50 kilometers within from the water's edge inland. Okay, so it's 50 kilometers wide around coastal borders. Land borders are featured in yellow. And if you own property along a land border, it's actually 100 kilometers wide from the border in. So it forms this uneven ring around the country. If you're looking at beach property in Mexico, which many, many foreigners are, you're going to be looking at property within a restricted zone because you are going to be at least on a coastal border, if not in an area that overlaps both. Okay, so that restricted zone is what we're referring to. Again, talking about what we just discussed. If you are a foreigner and you're looking to buy and that property is located within either the yellow or red areas, you will be putting that property into a bank trust. Okay, it's called a Fideicomiso. So what is a Fideicomiso? What's this bank trust about? All right. Like we've talked about, if you're a foreigner and you're buying residential property in the restricted zone, this is how you're going to hold title. There are various types of trusts in Mexico, and there is a specific type of trust that was created for foreigners to hold property within the restricted zones. If you go back to that Mexican Revolution example I just gave, at the time of the revolution, Mexico actually said, and I'm going to go back to this slide, no foreign ownership within the restricted zone. It's in their constitution, this restricted zone, and the laws that sort of surrounded it said absolutely no foreign ownership. They were concerned about, frankly, Spain coming back in and buying along their borders and bringing back in artillery and people and trying to take back some of the mines and the haciendas and all of the natural resources that they had dominated. And so they were very concerned about that. And so when they created this restricted zone, it's now inside the Constitution. And at the time, turn of the century in the early 1900s, they said absolutely no foreign ownership. Okay. Now, if you fast forward, obviously Mexico a lot of things have happened, right? Mexico has warmed up to foreign investment significantly. There is, the advent of airplanes and tourism and manufacturing and development and all of the trade agreements and things like that. So Mexico still establishes and asserts that it is within their national security interest to understand what foreigners own on their borders. But the laws surrounding that restricted zone have changed. And now foreigners are absolutely allowed to own. And the way they do that is within this trust that they've specifically created for foreigners to do that. Okay. The bank trust works exactly like any other asset trust would if you're in the US, Canada, and Europe. The only difference might be that maybe in your home country, private attorneys may be the trustee and administrate that trust. Here in Mexico, some banks are federally certified to be able to hold these trusts and administrate them. And so that might be the only difference. When you take property in trust, okay, it is deeded to the trust and you become the primary beneficiaries of that trust. Let's take an example, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, okay? Mr. and Mrs. Smith become the primary beneficiaries of the trust held at whatever bank, okay, that's authorized to do that. You can select your bank. And Mr. and Mrs. Smith, as primary beneficiaries, are able to use that property just as if they held direct title. You can remodel it, you can rent it, you can use it, you can destroy it, you can, rip it to the ground if you like. You are allowed to do everything that you would as a direct title holder, all right? You're also able to appoint secondary beneficiaries. So in your trust, typically it'll be, if let's say it's Mr. and Mrs. Smith, it says if anything happens to Mrs. Smith, the property goes to Mr. Smith. If anything should happen to Mr. Smith, it would go to Mrs. Smith. And if anything ever happened, God forbid, to the both of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, then it goes to their secondary beneficiaries, which Mr. and Mrs. Smith appointed at their bank. Maybe their children, Jack and Jill, okay? And so 50% can go to Jack and 50% can go to Jill, or 75-25, however your estate planning wants to set that up. So we'll talk about what advantages that has in a moment, but you can either name yourselves personally, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, or if there's some reason for your estate planning back in your home country that you want an LLC or a company to be the primary beneficiary of that trust, a foreign company, you are able to do that as well. It raises some tax questions at the end because you're no longer a person doing it, you're an entity, and so you're not able to do some of the tax exemptions that are available to people that own directly own land. But so you want to talk about the tax implications of that. If you're considering putting in an LLC or a company's name as the primary beneficiary of the trust, you want to definitely discuss that with someone. By and large, most people buy it as Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Okay? The trust has a 50-year term. So the trusts say at the end of 50 years, Mr. and Mrs. Smith or their beneficiaries can choose to renew it. And you can choose to renew those into perpetuity. All right. Going back to Margarita fever, there's a lot of misinformation out there that says that you get a limited number of renewals. That is not the case. You can renew this over and over again for whatever terms exist. It used to be actually 30-year trusts, and they've extended it to 50. There's been some talk about extending it even to 90 years, but they haven't done that. So very simply, and I've done this with some clients who had 30-year trusts, which have now come up for renewal. It's pretty simple. You're just going to acknowledge to the bank that you want to continue to hold the property. They're going to solicit another permit, and off you go for another 50 years. Okay? You can continue to do that. If you buy property outside the restricted zone, okay, and focusing on residential property, you can take title directly. You don't need a trust. You don't need a corporation. You can take title directly. And that would be how all Mexican nationals, as well as foreigners that are buying outside the restricted zone, they're able to take their residential properties directly in title without needing a bank trust. But I'm here to say that they should consider it. So what are the advantages of this bank trust, this Fideicomiso? It's very simple. Remember, you are a foreigner buying in a foreign country. Okay? When you buy outside your home country, if you're from Canada, if you buy outside of Canada, excuse me, if you're from the United States, if you buy outside the United States, I don't care if it's Mexico, Jamaica, if you're the US and you're looking at something in Canada, wherever, it is highly advisable, if it's available, to put property into trust in that country. Now, Mexico happens to require it if that property is in the restricted zone. But I'm here to tell you that that is the way you ought to be buying international property in the first place. Why? Because other countries don't recognize your estate planning and your estate planning documents that you created in another country. If I'm a US citizen, and I am, okay, so let me use myself as an example. If I have a will sitting in the United States that was executed there that says that I want my Mexican property to go to my kids, that's not a legal document in Mexico. It has no legal bearing. And imagine you have relatives that are inheriting what's likely a fairly sizable cash asset. They may not speak the language, and the property ends up in probate, because you have no will or no direction on what happens, and the only thing they show up with is a foreign document that's not legally recognized. This is not a situation you want to have happen. And so if you buy properties that are outside of your home country, it is highly advisable that you put those properties into a trust. Why? Because if you remember what we just talked about, that takes your deed and folds it up very nicely into a legally recognized envelope within that country and has very, very clear instructions on what happens upon your death. Okay, so there is no doubt in Mexico that if you were to pass away, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the both of you, it is to go to your children in the following percentages, and it gets titled that way. Okay, so I'm here to tell you that don't feel like the Fideicomiso is some sort of disadvantage or some sort of burden. This is what you want to do anyway. Okay. And I have advised many, many foreigners that have bought within the interior of Mexico to go ahead and put their property into trust because it eliminates the potential for any type of probate action. Now, if you're going to buy in the interior and you're not, then you need to get with an attorney who is very well advised in estate planning, particularly for foreigners, and make sure that you have wills and documents in place so that your heirs do not end up having to, adjudicate this in a Mexican court system. Okay, they don't live here, they don't speak the language, and you probably haven't left them enough money to do that, although maybe you have. So, you absolutely want to make sure that the inheritance part is very, very clear, and a trust does that. Okay, it's very effective at doing that. So my strong suggestion is any foreigners, if you're buying outside of your home country, put those properties into a trust within that country so that your estate planning becomes very clear, okay, and not at risk. Now, owning within a Mexican corporation, all right? This is another thing that I want to clear up. If you happen to look online, especially information that is old, you will see some people advocating that whether you're a foreigner buying in the restricted zone, a foreigner buying outside the restricted zone, even if you're buying residential property, that you open up a Mexican corporation and have that Mexican corporation take title. And they'll go ... because that avoids having to have the bank trust. Anytime you see information like that, know it's bad information, okay? Not only is it bad information, it may be somebody that's maybe unethically trying to steer you in a way where they make money off of creating a corporation for you. I want to be very, very clear on this point because it is a common misconception. If you are buying residential property, okay, not commercial property, but residential property, a home, a condo, even if you want to rent it for vacation rentals, you're buying a private home, a privately owned condo. If you say yes, and it is in the restricted zone, yes, the law is very clear. You are to own that property within a Fideicomiso bank trust. You are not to open a Mexican corporation and hold that property. The law is very clear that that's inappropriate, okay? On top of being against what the law states you should do, okay, it also obligates you to all the commercial taxes and legal obligations of a corporation. And I'm here to tell you, I operate a Mexican company. It is a lot of work. In Mexico, we file our taxes monthly, not annually. So imagine you are buying a property, okay, it's residential, it has no commercial activity going on whatsoever. There's not monthly, it's not for lucrative ends. Now, don't misunderstand me. You can rent a residential property. That's not a problem, okay? But to hold that property, okay, it obligates you to all sorts of expenses and headache. You have to go in and get your tax ID numbers and your electronic file numbers, and you have to have foreign bank accounts, and now you're needing foreign accountants, and now you're needing accountants to translate those taxes and send them back to your home country, and now you have a big tax bill in your home country because now your accountant is now filing international taxes and coordinating with another accounting office. This is not the route you want to go, okay? And at the end of the day, you're subject to corporate tax rates. And frankly, you won't have a ton of deductions as you would have had you been operating a normal business that has normal ins and outs of a normal business. So not only are you obligating yourself to a lot of expenses and overhead during the time that you own it, you also exclude yourself from the possibility of any personal tax exemption that you might receive on capital gains because it is not owned in your personal name. Okay. Now this also harkens back to when we were talking about whether if you want an American company LLC to be the primary beneficiary of your trust, in that case, you are also excluding yourself from any possibility of a tax benefit on capital gain when you go to sell because you're not a private person selling. Okay. If you have any questions about the capital gain, we have a webinar on that. We're actually doing a brand new webinar, March 2020, and we'll have that up. We'll go through that. But know that at the end of the day, if you are buying residential property, do not place it within a Mexican corporation. buy it in a bank trust. Okay. Now, if you are buying multiple homes because you are a contractor, a developer, and you are not planning on owning those long term, and you want to flip them, and you're going to go in and you're going to, tear them out and remodel them and flip them, completely appropriate. Open up a Mexican corporation. You're going to have employees you're going to be paying. You're going to be having, expenses in and out. You're going to be selling these homes and buying these homes and filtering them through. Completely appropriate. Okay. I have clients that have 2 and 3 properties in Mexico, and they have 2 or 3, however many they own, bank trusts. Okay. Even if you own multiple properties, do not obligate yourself to a Mexican corporation unless you are going to actually have regular commercial activity. Okay. Not only is it against the law, it also is a huge headache and a lot of expense that frankly never pans out in the end. Okay. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this, but I want to mention ejido property. When you go to look at property in Mexico, you want to be looking, and it sounds pretty obvious, like I'm stating the obvious, you want to be looking at titled property. There is a registry of properties in each state. You want to be looking at titled property that has a deed which has been registered in the Registro Público of your state, the public registry of your state. Ejido land. If we go back to that Mexican Revolution example, okay, ejido land was, after the Mexican Revolution, tons of very, very poor Mexicans that have been living as, as I mentioned, indentured servants, feudal serfs, that type of situation, had no money to get started, had no way to purchase land from the government. So the government took huge swaths of land and basically gave it over possession rights. It was owned by the Mexican government, but possessionary rights to ejidos, which are very, very interesting. It's fascinating. Not time for it today, but it's a very autonomous cooperative of Mexican nationals, okay, that have possessionary rights over a section of land, okay, that's owned by the government. When you hear about, or when you heard about in the late 1980s, the whole fear about buying in Mexico and the government will take it away from you, that all came from a huge expose. There were some very wealthy investors that had invested in a piece of, in a project, in a development, and it was on ejido land. And the government and the ejido said, thank you very much. And I don't want to say took back the property because they never had it in the first place, but that created all of this news and spin that sticks in people's minds today. I want to be really clear. Working with a good agent, after today, you'll know what titled property is. You just don't want to deal with ejido. I'm here to say that no matter what somebody tells you, as a foreigner, you have absolutely no ability to have any type of possessionary rights within an ejido. Okay? Not for you. It's only for Mexican nationals, Mexican citizens, and is not land that you would be eligible to purchase. You want to be purchasing titled property. So the next question is, okay, so I'm buying my property. I'm buying my property within a restricted zone, so I need a bank trust. Or I'm buying it outside the restricted zone, and I've decided to either take deed directly and figure out with an attorney my estate planning, or I'm also going to go ahead and voluntarily put that into trust. So next question, well, is my investment secure? And I'm here to say yes, okay, for a lot of different reasons. One, the chain of title is fully researched at the time of purchase. The attorney that's involved in the transaction will fully research title and make sure it's free and clear of any liens before that title transfers into your name, okay? The purchasing process is also very secure. We open, and your realtor should be opening a licensed bonded escrow account, third-party escrow account, to hold any funds until the time of close. I know that sounds so basic because we are all used to this, but please know, talk about margarita fever. There are people that come down here, shake somebody's hand, give them $10,000, and are shocked when 6 months later they come and this guy has taken their money and left. Like, nobody would ever do this in their right mind. So why do it here? Okay. It's a really good rule of thumb. All right. And I know it sounds ludicrous, but it happens and it's unreal to me. They would never do that in their home country. And likewise, use the same common sense. You wouldn't do it here. The process might be a little bit different, but common sense still applies, okay? Use an escrow account. You're going to put your money into escrow. Those funds are going to be held while title, due diligence is done and title is perfected. And then, you have a secure transaction. I also want to mention that buying property in this trust is not a loophole. I don't want you to think that, somebody's found some scheme to get foreign owners to be able to buy within the restricted zone when really they're not able to. That's not the case, okay? It is not a loophole. The restricted zone has been defined in the Mexican Constitution, and the laws in the 90s really changed that surrounded how foreigners could own in that zone. And the Mexican government created there are lots of different types of trust, but they created a specific trust that is exactly for foreigners to own property within the restricted zones. Okay, so this is not a loophole. You are not only, have I already told you, using a device being a trust that's legally advisable outside of your home country for any type of purchase, you are using the vehicle that was specifically created for this purpose. Okay, not kind of a workaround or a loophole where things get sketchy. All right. Another thing that happened, and I mentioned this, is right after, when I was selling property, people would ask me, right after Lehman Brothers collapsed, right, in 2007 in the US, when that whole financial collapse happened, people went, wow, if my bank is my deed holder, what happens if my bank were to collapse? Okay, and that's a good question, but not one you have to worry about. So banks are federally authorized to administrate trusts, and it's an administrative duty only. Your asset is not owned by the bank, and it's not leveraged by the bank. Okay, so if for some reason, it hasn't happened, but let's say your bank that owns your trust closes, right? Closes, goes under, just decides that they don't want to do bank trusts anymore, whatever. It's very simple. The process is there. Your administrative, the administrative task of administrating your deed simply transfer to another federally authorized bank. Okay, the actual bank itself has nothing to do with the integrity of your ownership or your deed. Okay. And the other thing I want to mention is, is it secure? Yes, those trusts are renewable. All right, as I already mentioned, if it's a 50-year trust, when it comes to the end of the 50 years, you can continue for another period and another period as long as you'd like to keep that property in trust. You can transfer that trust to another foreign owner. So if somebody comes along and you've used 5 of 50 years and you've decided to sell, a foreigner can come along and take the remaining 45 years of your trust. If you decide that you want to sell after 5 years and a Mexican citizen comes along, the deed comes out of the trust, gets pulled out of that envelope, and the title is delivered to the Mexican national, Mexican citizen, unless they decide to open a trust. And a lot of Mexican families do for the same reasons that we've discussed, to avoid probate. So it's very, very easy to work with these trusts. However, I also want to make a point, okay? People say, well, is the government going to take my property? And I always say, well, they can, okay? They can take it for 2 reasons. Anywhere you invest, anywhere in the world, you are subject to the eminent domain laws, which means that if you buy property in your home country or basically any other country, the government reserves the right to be able to pay for properties that are in an area that they want to use for the common good. They want to turn into a park or a highway or a, whatever. They have to buy those properties from those people and have the right to do that. So you still are subject to eminent domain laws, just like you would be anywhere with any property in the world that I'm aware of. And the other thing is that your property could be seized by the federal government if you were found guilty of federal crimes. So, and this happens all the time. You hear about these big cases, fraud cases, right? And they owe all sorts of money in the court costs and fines that they were assessed. And so they don't have enough cash, and so they're able to take the assets of this person and sell them at public auction to be able to pay off these expenses for the costs that they've cost society, really. You know, you're subject to that. So, you know, if you're Pablo Escobar and you decide that you want to own a house on the beach and you're caught drug smuggling in that house, and you can't pay your bills and your fines once you're found guilty, the government can come in and take that property. But those are very extreme cases. You know, the government is not looking, hiding over people's shoulders, looking to snatch property. That is not it at all. It's for the, you know, after having committed very serious crime. So your trust is very secure. The buying process is very secure, and many individuals, as well as, you know, multinational corporations, own in Mexico. Financing. This becomes a topic that is very important when you're thinking about wanting to buy. I'm here to tell you that as a foreigner, you're going to need to pay cash for your property. And the cash you're going to have to require from your home country, not in Mexico. Okay? Traditionally, properties in Mexico are purchased in cash. There are a few exceptions. We're going to go over them quickly. Owner financing. Technically, there is a way that an owner can sell his own property and basically like what we would know in the States as land contract. Okay, where the owner is financing the property and the property transfers title at the time it's been closed after taking a series of payments. Okay, technically it's available. The contracts are available to do it down here. Realistically, there are very few owners that will do that. Why? Because if anything goes sideways in that deal, the possessionary rights in Mexico are very strong, and it can take quite a long time to adjudicate this issue and get their properties back. So most owners are just not willing to do the owner financing. They're going to expect their buyers to be paying in cash. Private lending groups. You will see all sorts of private lending groups online, the mortgages in Mexico type things. The mortgages that are available to foreigners in Mexico to date are all private lending groups. Typically, they're very short-term options. Okay, we're talking 5 to 7 years tops. They have quite a bit of interest, much more interest than you're used to paying on interest on loans in the States or in Canada. Okay, we're talking about loans of 7 to 8 to 16% interest. Okay, and it's typically very expensive to close those properties because not only do you have your normal closing costs, but you have origination fees, you have appraisal costs, and all of that wrapped in. It can add about 5 to 6% of the purchase price to your closing costs on top of the closing costs that you already have. So for all practical purposes, taking mortgages in Mexico is not really practical. The last option that a lot of people use is developer financing. So let's say you go into a project and it's a brand new project and you buy in what's called pre-sale. Okay, well that developer may say, you know, you pay me X, Y, and Z along these milestones of this project. At the end, you take title and pay off the balance. Again, this is typically short-term financing. And that financing will typically be a higher interest rate. And it is not, you know, they're not a bank. They're not going to give you a 30-year loan. You might get 7 or 8 years from a developer on the long end of things, but the interest rates are higher. About the only financing that ever really happens is some of that developer financing on new projects. Okay. There are special considerations about pre-sale. We'll get into that more later, but suffice it to say that's really the only financing that goes on in Mexico, and it's not a 30-year mortgage. So what financing options are available to you? That's really going to depend on your banking in your home country. All right. In the US and Canada, and as far as I know in Europe, none of those banks will let you use this house in Mexico that you want to buy for the collateral for your loan. You're going to have to utilize funds or leverage assets that you have in your home country. So that might be a home equity loan. That might be some sort of credit line the bank has. If you're a U.S. citizen, you can, and you have self-directed IRA retirement funds, you're actually able to use those to buy international property. So that might be a source of cash for you. Whatever source of cash you have, you're going to have to acquire it in your home country using assets out of that country. Okay, you're not going to be able to use the Mexican property for collateral. So when you come down, people say, well, do I get a better price cash deal? Well, they're kind of all cash deals in Mexico, right? So know that. Okay. So you've got an idea legally what the legal vehicles are to buy, right? You know, whether you're going to need a bank trust or if you're going to go with the direct deed, directly taking title, ready to buy, okay? Ready to start looking at properties. So no, I need cash. How much cash? Well, know that you need enough cash to buy your property, and we'll talk about that, your purchase price. But then you're also going to need about 8% in closing costs. Okay, they range, and why they range is I have 6 to 10 written there. Sometimes when you're buying huge pieces of property, the couple, $1,500 that it costs to open your bank trust it's a fixed fee, and it becomes a very small part of a percentage on a huge number. So when you get over, $1 million properties, you're going to start kind of clicking down on that 8%. If you're buying a small property, those fixed fees actually become a larger part of the percentage, a bigger piece of the pie there. And so you might be getting up and toward the 10% mark on less expensive pieces of property, things that are under 100,000. So what you want to do is plan on about 8%, but talk to your realtor and certainly find out. And plan on that cash needing to be available within 30 to 90 days in order to close. So buying considerations. To begin, answer the basic questions, okay? What is your budget? We've talked about what you need as far as closing costs, looking at property. How much space do you really need? And think about that. And I say that because, as a realtor, obviously I want you to be comfortable in that space. And if you have 4 kids and you know that your 4 kids are going to come down and visit you on a regular basis, so you need a 5-bedroom place, let's do it. Okay. But the reality is that a lot of people's 4 kids have jobs and they have kids and their kids are in sports and they have limited PTO, and those people don't get down. Okay. And so couples that have bought a 5-bedroom place sort of figure out that they might have been able to do a 2-bedroom condo and just rent a few condos when their kids, on the off chance that their kids get to come and don't need such a big place. Obviously, if the budget is not an issue, totally fine, buy what you want. But if you're trying to make the best decisions on a more limited budget, then really consider how much size you really need. Do you need a guest bedroom? Are you comfortable with just friends coming down and renting a place next to you, or maybe having a Murphy bed? Is oceanfront a must? If it is, that's fine. Okay. But 1, your realtor will need to know that. And 2, you're going to need to plan on paying the utmost premium on space. There is never more expensive property than generally oceanfront property, right? Per square meter. So know that maybe you can be in a much larger place if you're willing to take a couple of steps back from the water. Are you a condo person or are you a private house person? I don't know that there's really a good answer to this. I think you just need to think about it and think about how you're going to be using the space, right? Are you somebody that wants to be right in town in the thick of things, or are you kind of wanting to be private and out of town, maybe a little bit larger yard? Is vacation rental income a factor? And if it is, what is the income I can expect out of a property? And what are the seasons? I can't speak for all of Mexico. I can tell you in Puerto Morelos, we definitely have a season. Having a beach condo, it's like having a ski condo. There's a season for it. People come Christmas through Easter. So depending on how much time you're in that unit during that period of time will dictate how many weeks you have available. It's like 16 to 20 weeks a year. Okay. Income. I always want to be very, very clear with people on this because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, partly from developers trying to push properties, partly from uninformed realtors, and that is income on a rental property. I have clients that spend the winters down here and they go home and they spend the weeks of Christmas and New Year's with their family and maybe rent their place during the spring Easter break for families, okay? So they might rent 2 or 3 weeks a year. And with that 2 or 3 weeks, they cover all their condo fees for the year and all their property taxes for the year, basically have no overhead on their place. That's a pretty great deal, right? But here's what I want to say. If you have leveraged your primary home, let's say you've paid, you've taken out interest or equity, using your equity in your primary home to buy this place in Mexico, I want to ask you a very serious question. Can you make your mortgage payments and your loan payments without rental income? And I say that because know that no matter where you're at, rental income is always kind of the cherry on top. You cannot depend on it. And I do not want you to lose your primary home, okay, over this. If there is a big hurricane that year and it causes people to look elsewhere to vacation that year, if something like we've got the coronavirus going around right now, right? If that shuts down airports, and it's not that, I mean, think about when the swine flu hit, right? They evacuated a lot of people and stopped a lot of flights to Mexico. Any kind of pandemic, any kind of really serious economical crisis in a home country, right? When everything in the U.S. hit the fan, we definitely saw a difference in the number of Americans coming to Mexico because of their financial situations back at home. So I want to be really, really clear. If for some reason you weren't able to rent for a season, I want to make sure that you're comfortable paying any loan requirements that you have. Yes, vacation rentals can be lucrative, but they can also not be. And I want to make sure you haven't put your primary home at risk. How do you select a real estate agent? Well, the first thing you could do is if you're interested in Puerto Morelos, I'm happy to work with you. But if you're not, contact me and I'm happy to make a referral to an agent in another area. If you are interviewing agents, ask them if they're a member of AMPI, right? The Mexican Association of Realtors. Ask them if they're licensed. Most states in Mexico now have a licensing requirement. Do they have any federal certifications? Those aren't necessarily required, but they're a good indication that somebody's serious. Are they familiar with your market? This is really, really important. I don't feel like I would do a very good job being a buyer agent in Cabo San Lucas. I have no idea what condominiums sell for in Cabo San Lucas, and vice versa. Okay, so these are all good things to ask. In my opinion, if you are a realtor and you're not a member of the Association of Realtors in Mexico and you're not licensed, you're not a professional. Find an agent and then that you like and work with that agent to view all properties. This works just like it does in your home country. Your realtor's office may have some internal listings that they feature, right? That they're contracted to sell. But that doesn't mean that's the only thing they sell. These properties are on the MLS. They can show you any property on the market. So work with them just like you would be expected to work with a realtor at home, right? You don't have to realtor hop. You can pick your agent that you like to work with and have he or she show you all the properties that you're interested in. I think it's really helpful to come up with a list of must-haves, thinking and keeping in mind the factors that we just talked about, and discuss that with your buyer agent and find out if that's realistic. If I want to be oceanfront with a pool and 2 bedrooms, is that in a realistic budget range for me? Know that property sales aren't public information. So going back to the Mexican Revolution, again, Mexico set up a system of private land ownership. There is a record of deed, but it's not like I can walk into that register of deeds and say, hey, who owns this property? At home, I can find out who owns it, what they paid for it, when they bought it, et cetera. That is not public information in Mexico. And so it's really important, that even more important than at home, that your agent is familiar with your area to be able to guide you on pricing and local information. Just like at home, buyer agents have commission agreements with listing agents, and so it doesn't cost you anything to use their services, all right? They're being paid by the listing agent for bringing a buyer. So get ready to plan to see some properties with an agent that you've vetted and that you are comfortable working with. When you're getting ready to see properties, I can at least speak for Puerto Morelos. It might be different if you're looking in a non-tourist area of Mexico, but here, if you're coming and you're coming during the high season, most of these properties are occupied. And so we need 24 hours notice to at least to show some of them. So it's really hard. People fall in love with something and they come in, they say, we leave, at 6 o'clock today. Is there any way we can get in? Odds are no. All right. As a buyer, be prepared to see these houses in mid-rental condition. Remember, you're buying them and potentially want that rental income, but these renters are not going to be exactly prepping a house the way we might be used to seeing them, down to, pristine clean and, chocolate chip cookie candle burning when we walk in the door. These are going to have towels on the floor and bathing suits hanging to dry and sunscreen out, and, a family that's vacationing. So be aware of that, and you're going to have to look past that when you look at properties. And I think really good feedback. Work with your agent, develop a relationship, give them good feedback, especially on that first day. And that's going to give them a clearer understanding of, I love it when I understand people's, person's preferences, what their priorities are, kind of style that they like. And then that might be able to help them find other properties for you. The other thing is kind of keeping in mind of inventory. In Puerto Morelos, we're a small town. And so in your price range, there might only be 2 or 3 properties that we can look at. Whereas if you were in our neighboring city, Playa del Carmen, there might be hundreds, okay? So keep that in mind too. If you're looking for something quiet and quaint, you might only have a few options to take a look at. Okay, let's say you found a place that you love, you're ready to make an offer. Your agent is gonna help you draft an offer, which is gonna be signed and presented to the seller's agent, okay? It's gonna have all the pertinent details, including purchase price. In our area, many places are sold furnished. And so because of that, typically it'll say, let's give an example. Let's say the house is selling for $300,000 fully furnished. Okay, what I would do is create an offer for my client that says he's offering you $290,000 for the house and $10,000 for the contents. You want to separate out those contents because neither remember you have that 6 to 10% closing cost. Part of that is an acquisition tax. You as a buyer don't need to pay acquisition tax on used furniture, and the seller doesn't need to certainly pay capital gains tax on used furniture either. So separate those contents out and give them a value. Buy them separately. I generally include a timeline for the transaction. This is knowing how quickly can you get off work. So know that at closing, you're going to have to be physically present to sign. And if you're not, you're going to have to be represented by a power of attorney. So communicate with your agent to say, you know what, I can fly back down, just give me the word, or I'm going to need 2 weeks, or I'm going to need 3 weeks, whatever it is, notice to be able to buy a flight and get down once paperwork's ready. And then we can help set that expectation in the offer. Make sure that it includes the terms of payment, down payment, and final payments, and that everything's going through an escrow account. And generally what happens is an owner or a buyer in a traditional offer will say, I'm offering you X amount of money. Let's use our example, $290,000 for the house, $10,000 for the contents. I'm going to put 10% into escrow. That means that in exchange, Mr. Buyer, you are going to be pulling that, or Mr. Seller, you're going to pull that property from the market, and we're going to move toward closing. And my funds are, my down payment is no longer refundable unless title can't be transferred. All right, and that's in exchange for the seller pulling that property from the market. They receive that offer, and the sellers may accept it. They might counteroffer and negotiate on it, or they might decline it altogether. But I would expect that anything from the sellers be, in writing and signed by the sellers. And then the final would be, you've got an accepted offer. Hopefully, let's hope it works out and you got an accepted offer. What happens? Well, now parties are ready to move toward closing. So the next step is to find a notary and a closing service. We're going to talk about what a notary is here just in a minute, but parties will be provided a closing cost quote. So you as a buyer will know right up front what your closing costs are. Sellers will know up front what their any taxes they owe will be. This notary that provides this, what is a notary? I want you to take everything you know about a notary and get rid of it. The word notary is just a literal translation of the Mexican word or the Spanish word notario, okay, here in Mexico. And a notario is a licensed Mexican attorney, and they go beyond that and become certified, authorized by state governments to oversee certain transactions in that state, including sale of property, sale of real estate. So in a real estate transaction, a notary is required. It's the attorney that does all the due diligence on the title, They make sure that people are who they say they are in the transactions, and they also collect all the taxes and fees due to the municipalities, states, and federal governments in the transaction. They are a neutral third party. That's important to know. They're not working for you, the buyer, or the seller. They're a neutral third party, making sure that the transaction is legal and meets all the legal requirements. They're going to create the formal sales agreement, purchase agreement. They're going to ensure that the legality of the transaction, like I mentioned, they're going to perform the title search and pay the fees and taxes that are due from each party. So buyers often ask, well, do I need a private attorney since the notary doesn't really look out for my interests? This is really at a discretion of a buyer. I don't ever discourage it. I would say that 99.9% of transactions, my buyers don't use a private attorney. Having the notary involved and making sure things are, a legal transaction is more than sufficient. However, I don't discourage it, and I think there are certain circumstances where one would be highly recommended. One case would be in those pre-sales when you are dealing with a developer. That, I think, is the ideal time to involve a private attorney if you would like one to review those pre-sale contracts, make sure that your rights as a buyer are protected. That would be a great one. If there's any question about chain of title, if there's any easement issues or access issues, known, vices to that property, maybe you want to consult with an attorney. In general, and in by and large, one is not often used or needed, but that's certainly in your discretion. Next step would be once both parties have approved the closing costs, you're going to open up escrow, and that attorney is going to write up a formal purchase contract and include the provisions that you've already agreed to in your offer to purchase. And that's the legal binding contract that'll take you through closing. Okay, use escrow. We already talked about it. Notaries and attorneys here in Mexico are not licensed escrow agents. They cannot hold those. They do not have those trust accounts. You have to use a licensed bonded escrow company. There are accounts available in US dollars or in pesos, depending on how you're buying. In our area, a lot of properties are sold in US dollars. So we often open US dollar escrow accounts. This obviously protects your money for any unforeseen circumstances. I don't mean to say that buyers are unethical or dishonest, but a seller could take your deposit directly, and then what if they passed away, right? Before closing, or God forbid something like that should happen. You want to make sure that your money is protected. It also protects the sellers because the buyers have to put their money in prior to closing. You're going to deposit your earnest money that you agreed to deposit in the offer to purchase that was mentioned. You're going to do that. But usually they ask for about half of your closing costs up front, and that starts your bank trusts, and those expenses get paid out on your behalf. The balance of your closing and the balance of the purchase will obviously go in just prior to close. And that formal purchase contract will be signed. Due diligence is next. What happens is that notary goes in and puts a hold on the property tax ID number for that particular property, which means there's a transaction underway, and keeps any other parties from being able to deal with that property during that time, which is another safeguard for you. And they're going to perform that title search and make sure it's free and clear of any liens. They're going to open up that bank trust on your behalf, or if you're, buying and you need to open up a corporation, a commercial property, then that would happen. Once the due diligence is ready and the bank is ready, parties can sign. Now, literally, when the bank says they're ready, the notary could sign in about 24 hours. The problem is that, at least in our area, buyers are often foreign and sellers are often foreigners, and they need some advance notice. So this gets back to how much time do parties need notice to be able to sign? This is where you get the 30 to 90 days to close, okay? In all actuality, it usually takes about 30 days to have the paperwork ready. But parties need a little bit of time to get there. So this is where you get this 30 to 90 day window. If you know that you're not going to be available at closing, have a power of attorney signed for you, and have that power. You can do it from your home country, but it's easier. It's less steps if you do it while you're in Mexico. So if you're looking at properties and know you can't get back, have your agent do a power of attorney for you. with someone that you know, either trust at the notary's office or your, you know, whoever you feel comfortable signing on your behalf, or come down. When you sign at closing, once the bank and the seller and the buyer have all signed, everybody's going to be provided a provisional copy of the title transfer. That provisional copy will allow you to show that you've purchased the property, change electrical into your name, all of those types of things. At closing, escrow funds are dispersed. You get to sign, you get your keys, you get possession of your new place, and now you can enjoy that margarita that we talked about. Now is the time to have that marg, okay? Again, excuse me, it's about 30 to 90 days between the time that you open escrow and the time of closing. A lot of that has to do with the availability of buyer and seller to be there to sign. Back at the notary office, this isn't finished yet, right? He's already collected acquisition taxes from the buyer, capital gains potentially taxes from the seller. He has municipal fees he needs to pay. He does all of that in the background and then takes that big packet of paper into the public registry, and the public registry officially changes in the property record from it transferring from the seller to the buyer, okay? That means that the notary has up to 90 days to do his part, and the public registry has 90 days to do their part, which means that from the time the notary submits his paperwork, at least in our area, the public registry is very busy. We have a lot of property transactions, and so they take their full 90 days, which means that buyers get their deeds back in 4 to 6 months. Okay, if you're in a less trafficked area of Mexico, this may be a little bit faster process, but you will get a registered copy of your deed back several months after your transaction. And here's what you want to look for. Your deed is going to come back with the same deed that you signed. It'll be another copy of that. It'll have this important paper that's called the Boleta de Registro. That Boleta de Registro shows that your property's been registered in the public registry, and that folio number is your file number in the public registry. Let me grab a pointer here. Folio number is your file number in the public registry, and Boleta de Registro, okay? This is an important document. This shows that it was fully transferred and recorded, okay? So when people ask for a copy of your deed, they're gonna want the long pieces, the actual deed, as well as this Boleta de Registro. Here's things to keep in mind. We've already talked about this. Do not open a Mexican corporation if it's your intent to own residential property. It's only appropriate for commercial properties. Do list the property at full value. If you're paying $290,000 for it, then know that that will be recorded in Mexican pesos at the exchange rate of the day. Or if you're buying it for 3 million pesos, it needs to be 3 million pesos in the deed, less any costs you've set aside to pay for furniture, okay, and furnishings. But you do want to register the full purchase price. Do not register these properties for less than what you're paying for it. Number one, it's tax fraud. Number two, when you go to sell, you're going to have a huge capital gain that is not real, because it's going to be the difference between what you recorded and what you sell for. And so you want to make sure you get full credit for your purchase, on top of not committing fraud, okay? Be very, very diligent if you're looking at properties in pre-sale. Very diligent, all right? That's where I's need to be dotted, T's need to be crossed to make sure you are protected. We are going to have a webinar this year about pre-sale investment. And if you are thinking about pre-sale purchasings, I would definitely recommend you join us for that webinar. It is going to be in the beginning of March 2020. If you happen to be watching this video recording and it's after March 2020, look on our YouTube channel. It's going to be there and you can watch that video recording. Closings take, 30 to 90 days, like we talked about. You and your or a POA need to be present. Power of attorney need to be present. If you need to set up that power of attorney, it's easy to set up in Mexico. If you're back in the US, Canada, Europe, it can also be done, but it's a few more steps. At your bank typically will want original signatures on your documents. So even though you have a power of attorney, they may still have you FedEx envelope of original signed documents to them before close. Another thing you want to note when you're looking at properties, if they have any kind of homeowner association fees, because they're in some sort of type of condominium regime, okay? These are not comparable apples to apples. So be very careful to evaluate the amounts and what's included or excluded in them. Some condos will include gas and water in their fees. Others won't, and it's metered separately. Some have a separate assessment for insurance. Others don't. If it's beachfront, some include the beach tax in the association dues. Others pay it separately. So look at what it includes and excludes and take those costs as a whole to really compare. Don't just compare number figures. Once you've bought, what are your costs of ownership? Everybody's going to have their annual bank trust, provided you have that trust. It's about $450 to $650 a year, depending on which bank you have it with. In your tax rate, your property tax rate is set by your municipality. In Puerto Morelos, if you buy a developed residential property, it's 0.28% of the value. So if you pay $300,000 for it, take 0.28% of $300,000, and that'll give you what it is. Let me tell you what that is right now. If I take $300,000 and I do 0.0002, oh no, missing a zero, 4 zeros, 28. Let's see, 300,000 times. Well, if I could type in a calculator, we'd be better. $840 a year, okay? So $840 on a $300,000 home. You will have a federal beach tax if your property is directly oceanfront, and it depends on how many meters of beach you have. It can be a few $100s if you're splitting it between a condominium association. It can be $1,000, $2,000 for a private house and up. It depends if you have a huge piece in front of the water. But it's assessed by meter of beach. It's pretty simple to know. You just ask for that in your when you're doing your due diligence on a property you'd like to buy to know what that would cost. As far as overhead, you want to take a look at HOA fees. Like I said, they're not comparable apples to apples, so take a look at those and make sure you understand whole costs of ownership. Your property insurance, depending on what type of insurance you need to buy, from full coverage to do you need a hurricane policy rider? Do you just need liability and contents because it's a condo? What kind of property insurance do you need? That will be a cost. And then your utilities. Good to know what the place runs when it's occupied versus not. Maybe it's not occupied 12 months a year, or maybe it will be. So take a look at that. I hope that you have been able to learn quite a bit about buying real estate in Mexico today. I am happy to help. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me. If you need help finding an agent in your area, I'm happy to help look for you an agent. Contact me. That's our website, MayanRivieraProperties.com. You're welcome to take a look. We have info on our website, buyer info, lots of good information and listings there. If you would like to know about upcoming webinars, I really suggest you subscribe to our blog, PuertoMorelosBlog.com. We always post new webinars on there with links to be able to register for these webinars. If you have found this recording helpful, I would ask that you do one thing. Would you please share your feedback with friends and family, other expats? Take these links and share them on social media in your favorite expat groups or on your page. That's the one thing we ask. We don't charge anything for these webinars, but we do ask if you found them helpful, please share this information with others and help us promote this webinar series. That's the only thing we ask of you. And if you need to contact us, you're welcome to do that. This is our website and our blog, which I've mentioned. Blog is where new webinars are posted and announced. Website, lots of info there, plus our contact information, further contact information, as well as my email address. Note that Riviera has 2 I's. People often, I miss emails because they sometimes misplace that second I or leave it off. So you're welcome to contact me, and I'm happy to help you with whatever I can. Check out our webinar series if you're viewing this live. If it's a video recording, look at what we've got coming up in our lineup, anything scheduled, and check out our YouTube channel. We have a whole section on our channel that is just webinars. So you don't have to dig through all the videos. There's a whole webinar section, and you can scroll through the topics that we've already covered, and hopefully we'll provide you with really helpful information there. To get to our YouTube channel, go to our website, MayanRivieraProperties.com, and you'll see a little icon for YouTube. You can click that and it'll take you right to our channel. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and I hope you have a great day. I hope it's been very, very helpful. Thanks for attending.